Thank you everyone for calling in today. This is our second webinar in a series of webinars. This one in particular is topic around how to study for the exam. Just real quick, if you don't mind, before we get started, please mute all your cell phones. If you have any questions, please wait till the end. You'll see a chat function on the WebEx. If you don't mind asking your question inside that chat box, we'll answer those questions at the end of today's WebEx. All right. Just so you know, the WebEx today will be recorded for viewing and observation at a later date. Let's go on to the next slide there.
Okay. For some reason, I'm froze. Oh, there we go. The screen was froze. So I'm Shane Sidebottom, and I'll be giving the presentation with Brock today.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. So I was certified back in 2017, a little bit before Shane, as you guys can see on the screen. Just a little bit about my background, guys, as we get started. My educational history is really more targeted into the biomechanics, anatomy, physiology space. Did have a stint with the industrial engineering, systems engineering program as well, but heavily weighted more on the body side of ergonomics. Started as one of the ergonomists at Gulfstream Aerospace, left there and went to Coca-Cola to run North America ergonomics program. And just here recently in the last year or two, actually branched out on my own to start a consulting firm called Ergoology. We're out of Atlanta, Georgia, but we have clients actually worldwide already in Europe and across the United States. So just a little bit of background on myself. Shane, you want to give us a little bit of your history?
Absolutely. I'm Shane Sidebottom. I got my master's degree from Virginia Tech in 1997 in Industrial and Systems Engineering, Human Factors. I went to work for General Motors after I graduated, first as a plant ergonomist. So I was in the Lordstown Assembly Plant. I was there for about 10 years. In 2005, I went to GM's headquarters in Warren, Michigan, and I worked as a future programs ergonomist. About 4 years ago, I made the move from ergonomics to human factors usability. And about the same time, 2014, I volunteered to be the chair of the BCPE mentor program. I took over from my mentor, Dr. Bob Fox. And that's where I met Brock. Actually, I was his mentor for a little period of time there, and now we're giving the presentation today. So.
Yeah, Shane, I remember those days. You did a great job. I'm sure I had more questions than I needed to have, but that's what the mentorship program is all about. So
one of your main questions was, what's on the exam? How to study for the exam?
That seems to be a pivotal question for everybody, doesn't it?
It does.
Fantastic. Well, appreciate that, Shane. So let's go into really what this particular webinar is all about. It's targeted around the certification exam. As I mentioned in the intro section, this is a series of webinars that's going to cover some of the key spaces, the key questions that we get as mentors for the certification process. You can see some of those bullet points, those questions that are reoccurring and common. And we're going to cover these questions over the course of the year and probably into next year. I know one of the ones that we already covered is, why should I get certified in the first place? And we got a lot of great feedback from that. If you haven't heard that webinar, feel free to check out the recording after today's webinar. Shane, anything to add there?
No, I think that's good. We'll just go to the next slide. This is the path to professional certification. So first, after your education is complete and you've got coursework that reflects those core competencies, you would apply you need to have 3 years of full-time human factors and ergonomics work experience before you sit for that certification. And you'll create a work product. We're going to have a future webinar about work product and what sort of things you'd want to make sure to include. You'd have that reviewed by the BCPE, and if it's approved, then you'd schedule to sit for the exam. And go ahead and go to the next slide.
Yeah, absolutely. So Shane, just one thing I would add into that, a lot of times that 3-year period of work experience seems like forever and ever, but I tell people use that time really to grow your skill sets around, you know, seeing a project from beginning to end, right? And getting a lot of feedback from other ergonomists on what gaps may be taking place, where some areas that are infrequently thought of and looked at. That's kind of a great incubation period is what I call it, to prepare yourself and get ready for when the time's right to submit your application and also get ready for that exam.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, real quick, guys, on the deadlines, just to bring it to your attention, this is a pretty standard reoccurring process, but those that have already submitted their applications are going to be eligible to sit for the exam coming up in the spring, April, May time, 2019. If you haven't submitted your application last November, get ready to do so by April 30th, and if you do, you'll be able to sit for the fall exam in September and October. You can see some of the information down at the bottom of the screen here, and so make note of some of the things around paying for the exam fee, and really the 2 to 3 weeks prior to the exam window, make sure that you do get that exam letter, registration letter, because there's a lot of fine print details that the organization does a great job in communicating before you get ready to find that location to take that test. Anything to add, Shane?
No, I think that, well, the exam used to be offered in certain locations, and it was an exam that had a proctor. This is a computer-based exam, I think, and so you'll go to a center that's approved by BCPE to take this exam.
Absolutely. That was actually how I took the exam, Shane. I went to it was a public library, I believe, somewhere around Atlanta, and it was in the back room. She walked me back to the computer area and said, "You're here to take the, it starts with an ERGO exam, right?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, that's what I'm here for." So it's really cool that you have that flexibility to test without it being an inconvenience.
When I took it, it was in Las Vegas at an ergonomics conference, and yeah, like I said, it was in person with about 30 other people. And at that time, the exam was about 4 or 5 hours. So the format has really changed. The exam now is 125 multiple choice questions. It's in English only. It takes about 3 hours to complete, and there are no bathroom breaks. So you have about 1.5 minutes for each question. You're going to want to go through the questions pretty quick and not take too much time to think about the answers, I think. Passing score is 350 out of 500. About half of the people who take it pass. And I'm not saying this to scare anybody, but you really do need to take the preparation for this very seriously. So everyone who's taken the exam has certified, or who is certified, all of the mentors also, we're all pledged not to reveal any specific questions from the exam. So, and I would be hard-pressed to remember any specific questions from 2002.
Right. Yeah, me as well, Shane. Even 3 years ago now, I would just have to echo, and we'll talk here in a second a little bit about core competencies and how do you get prepped and ready. But it's probably something you don't want to take lightly, just based on the amount of material that is possibly on the exam. But at the same time, there's ample amount of resources out there to review and that are suggested to delve into. So.
Well, whenever I'm mentoring anyone, one thing I try to explain is where these questions come from. There's a pool of questions that have been developed over the years. A full list of material would be hundreds and hundreds of items because of the size of the field of human factors and ergonomics. But a lot of the questions are going to be from material on the BCPE reference list, and that's on the website. So these are a list of books. Many of these books are textbooks for classes at the graduate level in human factors. I volunteered to write questions before for BCPE, and when we did that, we needed to relate the question to a core competency, and we need to relate it back to the reference list also. So all of the questions that are selected by the exam board are psychometrically verified through each taking of the exam. So the test takers are compared with each other, and people who are certified answer the questions in the same way. Questions that don't perform well, that don't have a consistent response, get excluded from the exam. Okay, and I think any comments?
Oh, Shane, you got that covered very well. I think one of the most common questions we get is, how do I assess myself? You know, for me, as I was getting prepped and ready to take the exam, it was a little bit after the core competencies had come out, right? So a lot of the mentors, Shane included, that I was asking questions about the exam, they were already pointing back to these core competencies. And so really and truly, I mention that because these core competencies are a fantastic focal point to review and to ask yourself, you know, honestly, where do I feel like I score in my ability, capability inside these core competency spaces? And we'll look at each of those core competencies here in a second, or you can actually go to the link that you see on your screen. But what I would say, you know, for me personally, I had a really good background in graduate school around biomechanics, manual material handling. Was very well versed in anatomy and physiology, but it had been 6 years or so since my last statistics class. And so when it came into any type of statistical analysis, I had been removed from some of those concepts and equations and philosophies for quite some time. So for me, in reviewing some of the core competencies and the information that you can see on that link, I immediately said, wow, I need to freshen up on my statistics and spend a majority of my allotted time or study time weighted in that area versus back into the areas where, yeah, I've probably spent ample amount of time studying in years past that I could carry over and be competent in answering the right question on those exams. So in the last year or two, that probably has been the most frequent question / answer that has come up with mentees that are asking similar questions. You know, hey, Brock, I'm getting ready to sit for the exam. And there's one success story that I have in particular in mind where it was asked, hey, Brock, I'm getting ready to sit for the exam. You know my background as far as education. This is what I've done in the last 4 years as far as industrial experience and work. Where do you think I should go, or how should I prepare and how should I study? And my answer was actually the exact same thing. I said, you know yourself better than anybody. Go look at those core competencies. Take any type of sample test that you can take, the practice exams, and look at what categories you may struggle in, or it takes you longer to figure out what the answer is, and focus in on those spaces and kind of let the spaces where you know, you've spent a lot of time in the past kind of work for themselves. Shane, anything to add?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. No, I really agree. I came out of industrial ergonomics for General Motors, and so that's what I had been focusing on the most. But this exam isn't about being very knowledgeable about a small area within human factors and ergonomics. It's about having broad-based knowledge. So when you're ready to be certified, you look at the core competencies, you look at the classes that were in the application for the coursework section, and really nothing on there should be new to you. Nothing should be strange. You should be familiar with all areas of human factors and ergonomics, at least so that you'll know what the nomenclature means, what the terminology is. So, and don't just study the areas that you know really well. Study areas that you may have not studied before. You want to read a lot of different textbooks, reference materials to try to get that broad-based knowledge. So these are the core competencies that are on that exam. 34% comes from analysis, where you discover, you gather data. 33% on design, 24% on validation, and 9% on implementation. So you have to ask yourself, can I conduct human factors and ergonomics analysis? Do I know how to do research in this discipline? Can I design and develop systems using my knowledge in human factors and ergonomics? How do you evaluate a job, a system, something that's already designed? How do you validate that it meets human factors guidelines or regulations or requirements? And then how do you implement a human factors and ergonomics program? These are all things that are important for that exam. And I'll go ahead and go to the next slide where it's in more detail.
Yeah, sure, Shane. So let's look at this just a little bit deeper. For me, I look at these core competencies as the total package of running a project from cradle to grave or beginning to end. And I think the slides are getting ready to change. Shane, can you check on your side?
Yes, there we go. A little bit of lag.
There we go. So you guys can see, I mean, for me and most ergonomists out there, in order to start the process, we have to be able to recognize and analyze that there is a need, there is an opportunity. So you can see a little bit deeper, looking at more of the biomechanical, cognitive, physiological, human capabilities, limitations. That would be also incorporating a term called anthropometry or anthropometric data. You know, looking at it from a technology interface standpoint on the user experience side, there's certain elements of that. You know, I mentioned the term anthropometry, but looking at human-centered designs, okay, and that kind of brings you into stage 2. And the reason that there's core competencies in all these areas, I feel like, is because most of the time, I can watch it in every industry or company that I go in and consult with, there's individuals that are very good in 1 or 2 of these areas, but holistically, they have gaps or opportunities where they can improve upon, right? You may have somebody that's very, very good at implementation, the training side of things, but maybe what they're training on is not the largest opportunity at the table. So actually collecting and analyzing the data prior to that gets you the biggest return on your effort or investment, right? As you get into the design, develop systems, continue to remind yourself of a systems approach, multiple components all acting together, interacting together for a common purpose is kind of my thought process on what a system is, and then you can further define components as different elements or initiatives. So just keep that in mind. The validation piece, when you're working in research or you're working in the applied setting in industry, it's imperative to actually be able to do a follow-up and evaluate, what exactly was the change? What was the improvement? And based on that, how can we further show, an expansion of the same philosophy around whether it's a risk assessment or a job rotation, or designing and developing a brand new dashboard for a car in the human factor space or in the physical ergonomic space. And so validation really, really is a huge piece, right? And so all of these core competencies really they work together, they're intertwined, and the reason I feel like, and Shane, you can speak to this a little bit more, I feel like that the BCPE organization focuses on these is because this is a holistic approach to being a professional in the ergonomics and human factors type space, right? Shane, anything to add?
That's really where these core competencies came from. BCPE reached out to the people who are certified, who do this for a living. This is their careers. What do you do with human factors? You analyze, you design, you validate, and you implement. And you learn to do this in the classes that you take, but you also learn this from work that you've done, and that's why there's that full-time work requirement of 3 years. You need to have been a human factors and ergonomics expert full-time to develop some of these skills, this knowledge, these abilities.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk just a little bit about test-taking strategy. And this is similar for just about any test that you might take. On the BCPE exam, there's no penalty for wrong answer, so answer all the questions and don't leave anything blank. You want to eliminate the possibilities you know are wrong, and that just ups the odds of answering the right way. Some questions you might not know anything about, and if it's your background in industrial ergonomics, you might not be familiar with terminology in UX. And that's why I say you want to try to understand as much of the vocabulary in other areas of human factors as you can, so that you're not in that situation. You really want to work on the areas where you have weaknesses, and just be familiar with all of the field of human factors and ergonomics. If you haven't taken any classes in macroergonomics, but your background does meet the requirements to sit for the exam, I would get a book on macroergonomics and I would read through that. Information processing, biomechanics, psychophysics. We're always tempted to study the things that we love and the things that we know the best, but being a super expert isn't going to help you on this exam. There are some cases where knowing too much could be a problem. You might be tempted to overthink some of the questions, so you really do want to have that broad-based knowledge.
Shane, I laugh a little bit because I remember probably 5 years ago now when I was calling you and asking for mentorship advice, and I was directly telling you I don't know if I'm very strong in statistics, and you saying, well, maybe you should read this book or study a little bit on this or that, and I was like, I really don't want to because I'm not very good at that. I like the biomechanics piece.
Yeah.
So
and some people don't use statistics in their job every day.
Right. Well, and that was me, right? I mentioned a minute ago that after grad school and in those 3 to 4 years, my responsibilities on a day-to-day basis didn't require a whole lot of statistical analysis. So refreshing on the things that either you don't like, you don't feel like you're good with, or haven't experienced it in a while. Absolutely, I'll echo what you said. Those are the things that we really want to focus on.
we'll talk a little bit about some of the example questions. So this would be an
absolutely,
example.
Shane.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead. You want me to do this one, Shane?
You can go ahead and do this one. Yeah, it's good.
Okay. Yeah, so really the point here on the design side is, first of all, try to eliminate the clearly wrong answers, right? When we look at this, and you guys can read the question on the slide here, this is really a displays and controls question. And there's some really good distractor answers that are built in. They all relate to controls. They don't all relate to control grouping. If you look at A is related to control coding. And if you've read the military standards 1472, you know that the military, you know how the military thinks about control coding by shape, such as like a metal donut on a stick is considered landing gear. So if you're going to group controls, or if you're grouping controls, you want to put them together by sequence of use, by control function, and really by how often they're used. So the answer here, would be A.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next we'll look at another example. You don't want to overthink a question if it is in your area of expertise. So here, the question is, what's the most common guideline for work height? And since I worked in industrial ergonomics, immediately I think, well, what's the repetition? How often are you doing it? What kind of work is it? Is it precise work, heavy work? Who's the population that's going to use it? Is this mostly male factory workers? Is it a mixed population? How much force are the people applying? And you can really get into trouble by overthinking these questions. So here the right answer is C, elbow height. And that's going to be good for most people. A height of 40 inches isn't really all that bad, but that's more specific than a general guideline of elbow height. And what they're looking for really is a common rule of thumb. Okay.
All right, and one more example for you guys, and this is more on the user experience side, or human factors versus physical ergonomics. And you can see the question up here, and what I would just say is, recommends Jacob Nelson's book. It's called Usability Engineering. Highly recommend it. You really will learn things such as heuristic evaluation, which is the difference between participatory and iterative design, all about menu hierarchies. To answer this question specifically, you have to know what the term breadcrumb navigation means. This is kind of a special term from UX, user experience. And the breadcrumb navigation string might look like what you see down at the bottom of the page. It'd go home page to page viewed to page viewed to current page. So if you don't know what breadcrumb navigation actually means, it would be kind of tough to get this question right. You have a lot of heterogeneous information that might remind you of the heterogeneity of variance from statistics, and it sounds technical, but it's the wrong answer here. Answer C might trick people into thinking about information processing, which would be more on George Miller's magic number for short-term memory of 7 plus or minus 2, but wrong answer, right? And then the contextual category sounds like user experience, contextual inquiry, but it doesn't really necessarily make sense here. So hierarchical information, again, comes to the front based on a lot of process elimination, but also if you don't know necessarily what A means, hierarchical information actually means, if you do know what B or C or D mean, you can use that to eliminate those answers, right? And like Shane said earlier, you know, you need to answer all the questions, and so by process of elimination, you're going to get a greater percentage of getting something right by doing that. Shane, anything to add?
To sit for the exam, do you have to be an expert, a super expert in user experience or a UX? Absolutely not. But I would really recommend being familiar at least with some of the basic terminology in that area. A lot of people like to try to use common sense to answer questions in human factors, and a lot of this is science, and in the discipline, it requires a formal training. Common sense kind of breaks down with some of these things. Some of these words don't mean to us what they mean in general. So population stereotypes and controls doesn't really have anything to do with stereotypes about certain people, certain age groups. It has to do with what people expect. Do they expect up to be on, down to be off for a control? So, I mean, there's a lot of words that we use that are familiar to our discipline, and it's good to know. It's good to know this. I mean, I think that's what you get through your education. It's also what you get from reading through the reference list and making sure that there's nothing new there, nothing that you haven't been exposed to before. So I think we're near the end. Just have a few things in summary. Do you understand the core competencies that are required for certification? Can you analyze? Can you design? Can you validate? Can you implement? Do you know your weak areas? When you filled out that application, did you have graduate coursework in each of the areas? In some areas, you might have needed 3 out of 5 areas. I'd go back and look at those other 2 areas and make sure you have at least a basic understanding, because they could be on the exam. And just use good test-taking strategies to avoid those distractor responses when you're picking the right answer. The right answer is really the answer that most certificates chose when they were taking that exam, and that's all back to that psychometric verification. So, yeah. And do you have anything, Brock, to conclude?
No, Shane. Those are really the cornerstone pieces that I think that we continue to provide people when they're asking questions about the exam. You know, so just in summary, you know, Shane, on the next slide, go to the next slide.
Okay. Yeah, there's some references. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would just recommend go through these references, the list of textbooks that are on at this link on the web page. Scan through, read the abstract or the intro to some of these textbooks. Get a sense and a feel back to the summary section. Are they talking about design or statistics or manual material handling or anatomy, physiology, or human factors? And then kind of do a self-check, you know, with yourself, and then also using the second link you see here with the sample questions and answers through a sample test, and really just judge where you need to spend your time and go from there. Shane, anything to add in closing?
No, it's a lot of learning, but I mean the career is a lot of learning. Certification is really not where it ends. It's just where it really begins. You have this board that certifies that you're an expert. To continue to be an expert, you just have to keep up in the field. The Human Factors and Ergonomics Society's journals is a good way to do that. You just continue to learn through your whole life. And it's not work for someone who is passionate about this field, passionate about human factors and ergonomics. Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, guys, we mentioned at the very beginning of today's webinar session, WebEx, to type any questions that you may have in the chat feature. on the WebEx. So if you have any of those, feel free to go ahead and write those in now, and we'll try to answer those as we go here. And if you think about a question later on, it's pretty frequent that people take the information, think about it for a while, and then ask a question. Feel free to reach out and ask those questions directly to us. We're through the BCPE organization, and we'll be able to best guide you to our abilities and go from there. Shane, anything to add?
No, I think that's it, and I thank you for everyone who attended, and if you have any questions, just shoot us an email, and we'll be happy to answer. Did anything come through on the chat?
I don't see anything right now,
Okay.
but that's not to say that there's not a lot of questions that will come in the next couple hours.
I know we did get a question from someone who has a CEA, and that was a certification that existed in BCPE. You took a multiple choice question exam to get that, and you had the education part of it, but you didn't have the work experience part of it, and so this was kind of a certification that would transition into a CPE. And you know, really, the way to prepare for that CPE exam is the same as for someone who has a CEA as for someone who is coming into the process now. You want to look at those reference lists, and you want to look at the core competencies, and you want to make sure that you have a general understanding of all the different areas of human factors and ergonomics. Don't focus too much in on the areas where you already know a lot. Focus on being well-rounded. I think that's the key to success.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Shane, it looks like for now we'll sign off, and as questions come in, we will answer those. I would encourage everybody to, again, check out the first webinar, WebEx, that we did around why should I get certified. That's a very common question for people that are just getting introduced to the ergonomic space and or already are in the ergonomic space, but really want to know why they should go through the process to become certified. So check that webinar out, and then also check back in with the BCPE webpage periodically. We're going to be prepping and getting ready for our next webinar topic to be determined, but that should come up sometime around the fall area, fall time frame of 2019. So be on the lookout, and we will be in touch with you guys then.